They always said the most dangerous person
What
on a
are you?
plantation was the one nobody watched,
Stay still now.
the one who filled your cup, made your
This
bed,
can't be you.
swept your floors, and smiled when you looked their way. They said she was harmless. They said she was simple. They said she didn't have a thought in her head beyond what she was told to do. They were wrong about all of it. My name is Dinah, and this is the story of how I brought an entire world crashing down. Not with a gun, not with a knife, not with fire, but with patience, silence, and the darkest gift the Georgia swamps ever gave me. I was born in 1831 on the Hargrove Plantation, 12 miles outside of Savannah, Georgia, on a stretch of land so flat and so wide, it felt like God had pressed his thumb down on the earth and held it there. The Hargrove estate was what white folks in those days called a showpiece. 300 acres of cotton, a white columned house that sat at the end of a magnolia-lined road, and somewhere around 80 enslaved people who kept every inch of it running while the family that owned it took all the credit and all the money and called themselves blessed by the Lord Almighty. I never knew my father. My mother, whose name was Celia, told me once that he had been sold before I was old enough to remember his face. She said he had kind eyes and hands that were gentle even after a full day of field work. She said he used to hum when he walked, low and quiet, like he was carrying a song inside him that had nowhere else to go. I spent a lot of my childhood trying to remember a hum I never actually heard. My mother worked in the fields until I was about 5 years old, and then something happened. I never fully understood what, and she was brought into the house. The big house, as we called it. The place where the Hargrove family lived, with their crystal glasses and their silk curtains and their dinner parties, where men in fine coats talked about politics and the price of cotton and God's divine plan for civilization. My mother became a house servant, and because she was a house servant, I grew up in the shadow of that house, close enough to touch the world I was never allowed to enter as a full human being. Mrs. Hargrove, Mrs. Eleanor, as we were required to call her, was a tall woman from Charleston, with pale gray eyes and hair the color of dried corn husks. She wore her cruelty the way she wore her pearls, always present, always on display, always polished to a shine. She never raised her voice. That was the thing about her that still, even now, makes something cold move through me when I think about it. She never screamed or cursed or flew into a rage the way some of the overseers did. She was quiet, controlled. The kind of woman who could decide your fate while discussing the weather, who could order a punishment while arranging flowers, who could look straight through you like you were a window and not a person, and smile the whole time. I was 7 years old the first time I understood what I was to her. I had been playing near the kitchen garden, the way children do, not thinking about anything in particular, just existing in the warm afternoon the way children are supposed to be allowed to do. I had found a broken piece of blue china near the garden wall, probably fallen from a window or dropped by someone, and I was holding it up to the light, watching the way the sun moved through the blue. It was beautiful. I remember thinking it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Mrs. Eleanor came around the corner of the house and saw me holding it. She didn't yell. She just looked at me with those pale gray eyes and said, very calmly, "Put that down, girl. That doesn't belong to you. Nothing here belongs to you." And then she walked away, 7 years old. And in that moment something shifted inside me that never fully shifted back. I put the piece of china down on the ground. I walked back to the quarters where my mother and I slept. And I understood, for the first time with my whole body, and not just the surface of my mind, exactly what my life was, exactly what they had decided I was. Nothing here belongs to you. I grew up in that understanding the way you grow up in weather. It was just the condition of existence. My mother taught me everything she knew about surviving inside it. Keep your eyes down, but your ears open. Learn what they need before they ask. Make yourself useful enough that they don't think too hard about you. Be present but never visible. Exist, but don't be seen to exist. She also taught me other things. Things she had learned from her own mother, who had been brought from West Africa on a ship when she was a young woman, surviving a crossing that I still cannot think about without my breath going shallow. My grandmother, Nana B., we called her, though her true name was something older and more beautiful than anything the Hargroves ever gave her. She carried knowledge inside her like a treasury. The names of plants, the behavior of animals, the way the natural world worked, at the level of root and soil and instinct, in ways that didn't show up in any of the books lining the Hargrove library. My mother passed that knowledge to me in pieces, late at night, whispered in the dark of the quarters while the plantation slept, and the Georgia night made its sounds all around us. She taught me the names of snakes. She taught me which ones were dangerous and which ones only looked it. She taught me where they lived, what they ate, how they moved, when they were calm and when they were not. She taught me this not as a weapon, not yet, not consciously, but as survival knowledge. Out here, she said, knowing what can kill you is how you stay alive. I listened to every word. I remembered everything. By the time I was 12, I knew the swamps and wood margins of that plantation better than anyone alive. I knew where the cottonmouths sunned themselves on the fallen cypress logs near the south edge of the property. I knew where the timber rattlers liked to coil in the dry grass near the old smokehouse. I knew which pools held what, which logs hid what, which sounds at night meant danger and which meant something else entirely. I never told anyone how much I knew. That was the first lesson of my life, and I had learned it well. Knowledge, for someone like me, was something you kept hidden the way you kept a candle hidden in a storm, close to your body, shielded with your hand, because the second someone else saw the light, they'd have a reason to put it out. The years moved the way years do when you are living someone else's life, slowly from the outside, like running through water on the inside. I worked in the house through my teenage years. I cleaned rooms, I carried water, I helped in the kitchen. I helped dress Mrs. Eleanor and her daughter, Miss Catherine, who was 2 years younger than me, and who I watched grow from a spoiled child into a spoiled young woman with the kind of bored cruelty that comes from never once being told no. Miss Catherine liked to pinch. She liked to find small ways to make you flinch and then act like nothing had happened. She liked to tell you that you'd done something wrong in front of company, so you had to stand there and take it with a lowered head while the white visitors looked on with that mixture of discomfort and entertainment that I came to recognize as one of the specific textures of that world. I took it. I took all of it. The pinches and the corrections and the dismissals and the looks that went straight through me like I was made of air. I took it with the blank face my mother had taught me to wear. A face that said nothing, gave nothing, revealed nothing. Inside was a different country. Inside, I cataloged everything. I remembered every humiliation the way you remember a debt. I watched the family with the same careful attention I gave to the swamp and its creatures. I learned their habits, their weaknesses, their patterns, their fears. I noted who slept lightly and who slept deep. I noted where the keys were kept. I noted what made Mrs. Eleanor's composure crack, even for just a second. And I found it, eventually. I found the thing she was afraid of. She was afraid of snakes. I discovered it by accident, the summer I was 14. There had been a black racer snake in the garden. Harmless, quick, the kind of snake that eats mice and minds its own business. And a field hand had come across it near the kitchen steps. The snake was gone before anyone could do anything about it, but word reached the house that a snake had been seen, and Mrs. Eleanor's reaction was the first time I ever saw that woman lose her composure completely. She went white, Her voice came apart. She had every male servant on the property searching the grounds for 2 full days, and she did not sleep well for a week. A harmless black racer. I filed that information away and kept it where I kept everything else. Deep. Still. Waiting. The thing that changed everything happened when I was 23 years old. I had a daughter by then. Her name was Grace, and she was 4 years old, and she was the only perfect thing in my life. She had been born from a situation I will not describe in detail here because some wounds don't need to be opened up for other people's understanding. I will only say that her father was not a man I chose, and leave the rest of that in the dark where it belongs. But Grace herself. Grace was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been mine. She had my mother's eyes and a laugh that came from somewhere completely her own, big and unguarded. The laugh of someone who doesn't know yet that the world is trying to take things from her. She was 4 years old in the August of 1854 when Mrs. Eleanor decided she needed a lady's maid, not for herself. For her niece, a young woman named Miss Priscilla, who was getting married and moving to a plantation outside of Columbia, South Carolina, and who needed, according to Mrs. Eleanor, in the conversation I stood in the corner and listened to with a face made of stone. A young girl, docile and trainable, young enough to shape properly. They sold Grace on a Thursday morning. I was not allowed to be present. I found out afterward, from my mother, who had seen it happen from the kitchen window and who came to find me in the laundry where I was working, and told me in a voice that was barely a voice at all. I remember the water in the wash basin in front of me. I remember how still it was. I remember thinking, in a strange sideways kind of way, that I had to keep my hands very still so the water wouldn't move, because if the water moved, something inside me was going to move with it, and I didn't know if I'd be able to stop what came next. I kept my hands still. I kept my face still. I kept every single part of myself absolutely, completely still, and I started planning. I want you to understand something before I go on. I was not reckless. I was not wild with grief in a way that made me stupid. Grief, when you have lived your whole life in the condition I lived in, doesn't work the way it works in stories. It doesn't explode. It doesn't pour out of you in dramatic waves. It goes somewhere deeper than that. It compresses. It becomes something else. Something dense and patient and cold, like a stone at the bottom of a river. You can't see it from the surface, but it's there, and it doesn't move, and it doesn't soften. I had watched Mrs. Eleanor for 16 years. I knew that woman the way you know a place you've never been allowed to love. Completely, bitterly, with an intimacy she never bothered to extend back in my direction. I knew her fears. I knew her vanity. I knew the specific shape of her need for control and the specific shape of the crack in it. And I knew the Georgia swamps better than any person on that property, black or white, free or enslaved, had ever bothered to know them. I spent 3 months preparing. I told no one, not even my mother. This was not about protection. My mother was the most trustworthy person I had ever known. It was about something else. It was about the particular kind of power that exists in a secret. The power of being the only person who knows what's coming. The swamps along the south edge of the Hargrove property were home to what local people called black-headed moccasins, a variety of cottonmouth with markings that made them look, in certain lights, almost entirely black. They were not the most venomous snake in Georgia, but they were aggressive when disturbed. Unpredictable. And in those days, before anyone knew much about snakebite treatment, an encounter with one in a dark room in the middle of the night was an encounter with a very specific kind of terror. I had been observing them for years. I knew their rhythms. I knew the late autumn period when the temperatures dropped and they became slower, more sluggish, easier to handle if you knew how. My grandmother's knowledge lived in my hands. My mother's teaching lived in my fingers. I had caught snakes before, for reasons that had nothing to do with this, and I knew what I was doing in a way that would have been genuinely shocking to anyone who'd ever looked at me and seen only what they expected to see. A harmless girl, a simple girl, a girl who belonged to nothing and no one. I caught 4 of them over 2 weeks, working only in the deep dark hours before dawn, alone, with tools I had fashioned myself from materials I could access without raising questions. I kept them in a place I will not name, a place on the property that only I knew about, a hollow that I had been using as a personal sanctuary for years, accessible only through a route that required knowledge of the swamp I was certain no one else possessed. I fed them. I kept them alive. I waited for the right night. The right night came in the 3rd week of November, 1854. There had been a dinner party at the Hargrove house. Guests from Savannah, several families, the kind of evening that stretched late and left the house full of the particular exhausted satisfaction of people who had eaten and drunk well and talked about nothing important and felt themselves entirely at the center of the universe, the kind of evening that left everyone heavy with sleep. I had served at that dinner. I had moved through that room for 4 hours, filling glasses, clearing plates, invisible as furniture, while those men and women talked around me and through me, and about the price of enslaved people, and the blessings of the Southern way of life, and the threat posed by Northern agitators and abolitionists who simply did not understand the natural order of things. I had listened to every word with my blank face in place, and my stone at the bottom of the river exactly where it always was. By midnight, the guests had gone. By 1 in the morning, the house was as quiet as the inside of a closed fist. I moved through that darkness the way I had moved through every darkness I had ever known, completely, confidently, without sound. I had spent 23 years learning the particular geography of that house at night. I knew which floorboards carried weight and which didn't. I knew where the doors settled in their frames. I knew the pattern of the night watchman's rounds, and I knew that the half hour between 2 and 2:30 was the window I needed. I will not tell you every detail of what I did. Some things are mine to keep. I will tell you that I entered Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's bedroom on the night of November 21st, 1854, while she slept, and I will tell you that I left something behind. I will tell you that I was out of that room in less than 4 minutes, and that I was back in my sleeping place in the quarters before 2:30 came, and that my face and my breathing and my heartbeat were all exactly as calm as they needed to be when the morning came. Because that was the thing. That was always the thing. The most important part of what I had spent my whole life learning. Stay still. Stay invisible. Let the world move around you and do not give it anything to see. The screaming started at just past 5 in the morning. It started as one voice and became several within seconds. I heard it from the quarters, and I did not move, and I did not change my expression, and I did not look toward the house any faster or slower than anyone else around me did. I was a woman waking up. That was all. That was everything. What happened in that bedroom, I know only from what spread through the plantation in the days afterward, through the fractured, urgent, hushed relay of information that always moved between the enslaved people on the property, running underground like water under rock. Mrs. Eleanor had not been bitten. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about murder, and it was never about murder. It was never about blood. It was always about something else. It was always about a different kind of mark. What Mrs. Eleanor found in her bedroom at 5 in the morning changed her in a way that all the years before had not. What she found was fear. Real, uncontrolled, animal fear. The kind that doesn't respond to composure or pearl necklaces or the settled certainty of social position. The kind that reaches into the most primitive part of a human being and grabs hold of something that cannot be argued with or polished away. I heard later that she did not sleep in that bedroom again for 6 months. I heard later that she became convinced the house itself had turned against her, that something in the land, something in Georgia itself, had finally decided it had had enough of the Hargroves. I never confirmed or denied anything. I was a woman who swept floors and carried water and had a blank face and knew nothing about anything. But here is what I want you to understand, here in this moment, as you're listening to this. What I did was not the whole story. What I did was one act in a life that was being constructed, carefully, quietly, towards something larger. Because that stone at the bottom of the river, that dense, patient, cold thing, it didn't dissolve after that night. It just changed shape. In the months that followed, I watched Mrs. Eleanor's composure continue to crack in ways that had nothing to do with what I had done and everything to do with what I continued to do. Small things, quiet things, a particular route, ground fine and added to something that caused sleeplessness, a particular placement of objects that created a specific, unexplainable sense of wrongness in a room. Things my grandmother had known and my mother had passed to me, and I had stored away with everything else in that deep, still place inside myself. I am not telling you this to glorify harm. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what it is to live your entire life as property. To be told from the age of 7 that nothing here belongs to you, and then to discover, slowly, through years of paying attention to the world around you, with a quality of attention that is born from having nothing else to rely on, that you have a kind of power that cannot be taken away by any bill of sale, the power of knowing, the power of patience, the power of the person nobody watches. I never ran. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I know that when people tell stories about enslaved people who resisted, there is usually a moment of escape, a flight north, the Underground Railroad, the story of freedom found somewhere else. And those stories are real, and they matter, and the people in them were heroic in ways I cannot fully express. But that was not my story. My story was the story of staying, of remaining exactly where I was, and refusing, in ways no one could see and no one could prove, to be what they needed me to be. I was a woman who swept floors. I was a woman who had a blank face. I was a woman who had been told at 7 years old that nothing belonged to her. But I had learned the swamps. I had learned the snakes. I had learned the house in the dark. I had learned to be invisible, and I had learned to use that invisibility like a tool, the way you use a key, quietly, precisely, with the full understanding that the lock is only as strong as the person who doesn't know you have access to it. And I had learned, in the way that only deep, sustained, lifelong attention can teach you, that power is not always what it looks like. That the person who appears to hold everything, the land, the money, the law, the social order, the religion, the economy, the entire constructed machinery of a civilization built to guarantee their dominance, that person is still, underneath all of it, a human animal. Still afraid of things that move in the dark. Still vulnerable, at 5 a.m, to the particular quality of fear that doesn't care what your last name is or how many acres you own. My daughter Grace spent the first years of her life as property of a plantation outside Columbia, South Carolina. I did not get her back. I will not pretend this story has that kind of ending, because that would be a lie, and she deserves better than a lie. The wound of her loss never closed. It was always there, always open, the thing underneath everything else I did and thought and felt for the rest of my life on that plantation. But I want to tell you one more thing. One thing that happened 6 years after the night I'm telling you about, in the early winter of 1860, when the whole country was beginning to feel like a fever about to break. There was a night, I was 32 years old by then, when I was walking the south edge of the property just before dawn, the way I sometimes did when sleep wouldn't come, moving through the dark the way I knew how to move, quiet and certain. And I came to the edge of the swamp, to the place where the cypress trees stood in the water with their roots like clutching hands, and the whole Georgia night was around me, the insects and the frogs, and the particular wet darkness of that land. And I stopped. And I stood there for a long time, and I thought about my grandmother on a ship, crossing an ocean she hadn't chosen. I thought about my mother learning to make herself invisible to survive. I thought about myself at 7 years old with a piece of blue china in my hand and a woman looking through me like I wasn't there. I thought about Grace's laugh, and I thought about what it meant to still be standing, to have survived every single thing they had constructed to make survival impossible, to have kept, inside myself, in the deep and still place where nobody had ever been allowed to reach, something entirely my own. The swamp moved around me. The night went on. Somewhere in the dark water, something slid below the surface and was gone. I knew this land. I knew its creatures. I knew its darkness and its hidden things and the way it moved when it didn't want to be seen. And standing there, 32 years old, with the whole country trembling on the edge of something none of us yet fully understood, I felt, for just a moment, in a way that was entirely mine and entirely real, something that nobody had ever been able to give me and nobody had ever been able to take. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not their property, not their furniture, not their nothing, just Dinah. Standing in the dark she knew better than anyone alive, and knowing that sometimes that is enough. That sometimes the most revolutionary act a person can perform is simply to remain intact, aware, undefeated, in a world that spent every single day of your life trying to convince you that you were nothing. I was never nothing. I was always everything they were afraid of. And I knew it, even when they didn't, especially when they didn't. That knowledge was mine. "Nothing here belongs to you," she said, when I was 7 years old. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about all of it.